Welcome to the studio, everybody, and the last demo of day 4 of ClayShareCon. We are thrilled to have Michael Harbridge join us again. He's going to be doing a horsehair and feather raku firing demo. So if you've always wanted to know how to do raku firing and you've never seen it done before, you're in for a treat because you're going to get to see Michael do it right now. Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Great, Jessica. How are you guys doing?
Oh, we're great. So glad to have you here with us.
So happy to be back.
So tell us a bit about what you're going to do.
So I'm going to show you guys how to do a horsehair firing and also feathers, burning feathers on pieces. And I'll talk all about the kilns, the process of preparing the pieces, the firing, the sealing, different things with horsehair. I'm sure you guys will have questions about burning other things on there, and we'll talk about that as well. But I'm actually going to kind of do this in reverse. I'm going to show you taking the piece out of the kiln first. We're going to do the horsehair, we're going to do the feathers, we're going to let the piece cool, and we're going to go back into my classroom, and I'll kind of explain the process that I did to get to the point of putting it into the kiln. And I've got my wife Janine is here. She's going to be lifting the lid on the kiln for me. I've got it set up with a pulley so that, and I'm working in an electric kiln. A lot of people think that they can only do raku firing in a gas kiln. And I've done it in electric kilns for a long time. And I'll just say up front too, that you're going to hear different processes for raku firing. And tomorrow I'm going to do another raku firing using stencils. And I don't want to say there's not a right or wrong, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. So you may hear different processes. This is what I've adapted over the years and what works for me. And so if you're taking different workshops from people, take bits and pieces from every one of those instructors and do what works for you. Sometimes, I'll have people will argue with me about the temperatures that I go to, or somebody will be in another teacher's workshop and say, oh, well, Harbridge said, and I just kind of cringe because it's what works for me. So try it out, do different things, and we'll talk about temperatures and all that stuff once we get going. But I want to show you kind of the setup here. So I've got one of my big kilns here, and I've got one that's about waist height. It's a Gen Ken. It's one of their mega coil kilns. It's got a tap screen controller on it. And what I like about the electric kilns is the ability to control the temperature. So earlier today, I programmed it to go up to 950 degrees. I'm in central Wisconsin. It's very cold here. The sun's out. It's deceiving today, but it's very cold. And so I usually go to between 900 and 1,000 degrees, depending on the temperature and what all is going on. So, and I'll talk about those temperatures. If you can see up on the ceiling here, this is actually under our deck. We've enclosed this and we put a steel ceiling in. And I've got a metal cable that runs from the lid of the kiln, and it loops around and hooks on. It goes up to a hook on the ceiling, and then that cable is going to come over here, and Janine's going to grab that cable and pull the lid open. And the other things that I've kind of got prepped here is my surface. So I've got the surface of a smaller kiln here that I'm going to be putting the pieces on with the horse that I'm going to actually, once I take it out of the kiln, it's going to go on here. But because this area is very cool out here, I've got a shelf sitting on top of this other kiln that's running, and this kiln's probably up to about 1,000 degrees. So the shelf is warm. And the reason I do this is when I take that piece out of the kiln, if I put it on top of something that's cold and in freezing temperatures like it is here, the piece is probably going to split. So I've got that shelf there, and I've got it nice and warm, nice and toasty warm. So when I take the piece out and set it on there, there's less chance of it cracking. And we'll talk about the wear and all that once I get back into the classroom. Normally, I don't wear gloves to do the horsehair and the feathers. I just put this on so that I could pick that shelf up, and I've got them handy here in case if I need them for something. But to actually work with the hair sometimes can be challenging when you've got raku gloves on or welding gloves on. So I do work with my bare hands. Now with the hair, it doesn't matter if the hair is light or dark or red or what color it is. And we'll talk again about the different types of things that you can burn, but this is horsehair. And so you'll have mane hair and tail hair. Usually the tail hair is a little bit more coarse. So I've got some tail here. The lighter color is tail hair, and the darker color hair that you probably can't see with my dark sweatshirt is some of the mane hair that's a little bit thinner. And then I've got feathers. And so these are just craft feathers, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. One of the things that I learned in doing workshops is I had people in the workshops, they would take their feathers and they would go to put it on the piece, and they were getting their hands or their fingers really, really close to the surface of the hot piece. And I was always so worried people were going to burn their fingers. So what I do in workshops is I have needle nose pliers so that they can grab that feather and they can put it on the piece, and there's no risk of them. Well, there shouldn't be. I guess there's still risk they can touch the piece, but they shouldn't, because their fingers shouldn't come real close to it by using a needle nose pliers. And usually in a workshop, I'll have 2 pairs of needle nose pliers, and I'll have people pair up so that one person has that pliers ready, and they can have it like this ready to hand to the person that's doing it. And then once that person is done with that one, they hand that pliers back and they have another one ready for them, because you have to work kind of quickly with this, especially when it's as cold as it is here right now. So I've got the feathers sitting here. I've got the pliers sitting here. I've got my hair. And the hair, you don't want to put big clumps like this on the piece. With horsehair firing, less is usually better. And so I usually tell people kind of have that hair pulled apart so that you don't have big clumps. And that too, a lot of times when it's somebody's first time doing horsehair, I'll have them pair up with somebody and have that other person kind of pulling the hair apart like this and having it ready to hand them small little bunches of it. If you put a big glob of hair on there, it's going to get really dark and kind of nasty and not real attractive looking. So I usually have the hair kind of pulled apart so that I've kind of got that prepped ahead of time. I've got this sitting here. Sometimes I'll actually put hair on the shelf if I want the hair coming up around the bottom of the piece. As that hot piece hits it, a lot of times the hair kind of sizzles up and curls up on there. On this particular piece, I'm not going to be doing anything with the hair on the bottom. So I'm going to have Janine grab the cable here, and I've got the metal tongs, and there are a couple different types of tongs available. This one does not have the teeth on it. Kemper makes a couple different types of tongs, and I don't really care for the ones that have the little metal teeth, because a lot of times when people are doing it, especially the first time, sometimes those teeth, depending how you grab the piece, will actually shift and the piece might slip a little bit on there, and they panic and they think they're dropping it, and they're not. And the other thing that I like about these tongs is the length of them. They're nice and long. So the ones with the teeth are a little bit shorter, and you have to get a little bit closer to the inside of the kiln. And so you want to make sure that you, with these long tongs, you hold them at the end. A lot of times I catch people holding up here like this, and then they have to get real close to the heat in the kiln. Utilize the length of those tongs. I'm going to be reaching in and grabbing a vase out. One end of the tongue is going to go inside the vase. The other tongue will be on the outside of the vase. The other thing with the tongs in cold weather like this, I actually have these tongs leaning up against the kiln so they too are warm. I don't want to have these freezing cold, grabbing a hot piece and shocking it and more risk of that piece cracking. So Janine's going to pull the lid of the kiln open just enough so that I can grab the piece out. Keep going. Keep going. And I'm going to set this piece carefully on my shelf. When I'm doing this in a workshop, I tell people don't touch it until I tell you to go. And then I can take this hair and I can just kind of wrap this and pull it down over the piece. Again, I don't want to overdo it with too much hair. And then the feathers I do last because they take less to burn on. And I try to press them. Sometimes with the feathers, I will put a glove on so that I can kind of press the feather against the surface. It's latched at the top. Janine's trying to get out of this room and the door is latched. Yeah, and if you love the smell of burning hair, you'd want to be here right now.
Yeah, it does stink, everyone. So
Yeah.
it's
You guys
burning
smell
hair.
it?
I know what it smells like, and I'm actually smelling it in my head.
Yeah. All right.
But it's part of the process.
So we're going to let this piece cool for a few minutes, and I'm going to come back out. We're going to head back into the classroom now, and I'll answer questions and stuff. No, just the one. Yeah, we're good. All right. So I'm going to head back into the classroom. I just got to turn the volume and everything off on this computer. And I'll see you guys in just a second.
So for those of you who are watching, this is a pot that Michael did the banding methods on. So if you watched that broadcast, you would have seen him put the color on this the other day. So that's that pot, which I was thrilled.
All right,
to find
I
out
got
he was
myself
gonna do.
unmuted, and I think I can hear you guys and you can hear me. Sometimes we
hear
get
you.
an echo if I don't get the, last year we had some issues with that, or another time we had some issues with that. So let's talk about the pieces first. So the pieces that I had, or the piece that I had in the kiln was earthenware. And a lot of people think that raku firing is a high fire technique, and it's generally done on a lower temperature. Tomorrow I'll be doing more of a glaze type raku method. But this piece was a piece that I had a mold made for, and I cast this with earthenware. If you're throwing a piece, I suggest, or hand building, I suggest getting a raku clay body. Raku clay bodies are made to withstand the shock of pieces coming out of the kiln when they're at high temperatures. If you're going to cast pieces with earthenware slip, instead of firing these to a traditional 04, I usually go like an 06, 07, which is a little bit cooler firing. And the reason I do that is because I find that there's less chance of the pieces splitting. But if you're using a raku clay body, you can go up to an 04. Raku clay bodies usually have some sand in them, and they've got some chemicals and things that make them, they can withstand the shock. If I fired these pieces, or I bought commercial bisque, earthenware bisque that's fired to 04, sometimes I have really good luck with it, and other times I get a lot of pieces that split. And so you kind of got to play around. And when those big kilns that they do that commercial bisque in, when those big carts are rolled into those kilns that are as big as a room, there's probably pieces in there that get a true 04 firing and some that don't. So again, either work with a raku clay body when you're making your pieces, if you're hand building or throwing. But if you're casting, do it with earthenware bisque, and then just do it to a cooler firing like an 06, 07. There are additives that you can add to casting slip that will turn it into a raku clay body. And actually, Paula, who was just on and did her session, she does sell a mixture that you can add to earthenware slip to turn it into a raku clay body.
So what temp do you raku to? What temp do you pull your pieces at?
So in this one with the horsehair, 950 to 1,000. I find that if I go over 1,000, and there's a lot of artists out there that go over 1,000 degrees. With the earthenware, if I go over 1,000 degrees and I pull that out of the kiln, there's more chance of that piece splitting. But you have to work quickly with it. And I had probably a minute there to get my hair on the piece. There comes a point where it gets too cool and the hair doesn't sizzle and burn anymore. So you have to work quickly when you're only going up to under 1,000 degrees. Some artists will go up to 12, 13, 1,400 degrees with pieces that are made with a clay body that can withstand that shock. What I do find though too is fuming. And so the hair will kind of fume. And so around the hair, you get that kind of brownish tan color, which I really like with horsehair firing. But I find that sometimes when people go really hot with their pieces, they get a lot more fuming and their pieces get really dark. And so if you find that your pieces are getting really dark, it can be a combination of too much hair. And this piece here, I like this piece, but some of these areas, the hair got a little thick. And when I was saying less is better, I don't particularly care for when I get really dark areas like that. So I kind of saved this piece to show you how much is too much hair versus just some nice lines and things on the piece. And later on in this broadcast, I'll go back and I will grab that piece that we just took out. We'll clean it up and I'll show you how to seal that. But like this one, I really like. It's got a nice coverage of hair, a little bit heavy up on the top there, but a little bit, but look at just individual strands, how nice it looks with just the individual strands. So more isn't always better when it comes to the hair. Now, when I do other raku firing, where I'm putting glazes and things on and trying to get the metallic finishes and crackle finishes, those I'm taking up to, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow, up to about 1730 degrees, which is cooler than what a lot of other artists do as well. And people, sometimes they see my finishes and they're like, oh my gosh, you know, what glaze is that? And I tell them what glaze, and they say, I don't get finishes like that. What are you doing different? And I found that sometimes going to cooler temperatures with some of those raku glazes is a good thing. So play around with your temperatures and try some different things. As far
And
as
just
the
to clarify,
finish,
because we have people all over, that's Fahrenheit temperatures you're talking
that,
about.
yes, sorry, yes, that is Fahrenheit temperatures.
Because we have people in Europe too that are watching.
Yes,
Just to
I
make
always
sure
forget about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, I don't know the equivalent of what it is in Celsius, but yeah, that's Fahrenheit. So what about finishes on these pieces? Now, for those of you who tuned in to my banding demo that I did the other day, that blue vase blue and white vase that we just took out and did the horsehair on was the vase that I banded, one of them that I banded. Most people will they'll make a mixture of like a terracige for their pieces, and it's a long drawn out process, and God bless them for going through that process. And it's a very cool process to go through, but I'm not that person that wants to sit there and go through that process. So I honestly work with things like underglazes, Mako's fundamental underglazes, Amico, their LUG underglazes, their velvet underglazes. Speedball, I haven't worked with theirs, but I know they have a clay equivalent. Duncan used to have cover coats. They're all like a clay-based type underglaze. And so I like to do my pieces with those underglazes, and I will apply 3 coats of the underglaze, and then I will polish the pieces. And there's lots of different ways you can polish and burnish, and I'll show you my process here that I do. If you want to know how to do the gradient blends, that was part of my banding workshop. You can go back and watch that video and see, like this one, I went from a blue to a turquoise to a white. This one went from a purple to a white. And this real tall vase went from a dark gray into a white blend. The one that I've got prepped for today, this one I actually did with Mako's cinnamon, their UG213. And this one is really cool. And I'll maybe post some pictures later of pieces done with this color, because it's a really deep cinnamon color. And if you use Mako's black ice glaze, and you do some black ice glaze on here, anywhere that the horsehair goes over the black ice and it burns, you actually get like a rainbow halo, almost like a mother of pearl effect on top of the black ice glaze. And so a lot of times I'll do the cinnamon and I'll do drips of the black ice there. It's one of their low fire earthenware glazes down the sides of the piece. And then when I do the horsehair on there, I get these really cool, almost raku type finishes over the top of that black ice. So I've applied 3 coats of the cinnamon underglaze to this. And while that color is still damp, I'm going to flip the camera down now for this. While that color is still damp, I want to polish the piece. And I like to work with these chamois, and I buy these at the Dollar Tree store, and they're used for like cleaning cars, and they're $1, and you get 2 big sheets of them in a pack. And I usually cut them up into smaller squares, and I run them through the washing machine to kind of soften them up so that they're not so stiff. And once the wet, shiny look is gone, I will take that cloth, but it's still a little damp, and I just work that in kind of a circular motion. Now, if I look on the cloth and there's a lot of color coming, you'll usually get a little bit will come off on there. But if there's a lot, it means that this piece isn't dry. And if I start seeing that the piece is getting scrapes and scratches in it, then it's not quite dry enough. But as I polish this, you can see here how much shinier and smoother it gets where I polish it. And there are different, some people will use a leather chamois to do this technique. Some people will use the back of a wooden spoon to do like a burnishing, or they'll use real smooth rocks to do a burnishing. And that's great too. Whatever works for you, do. But I find that these chamois work really well to get that polished look. Now, sometimes, and you can kind of see there's kind of a lighter spot here. And if you were here to look at this real close, it looks like a fingerprint on there. And it actually is from where my fingers have been touching. And sometimes people in workshops, they kind of freak out about that. They think, oh no, I've done something wrong that my fingerprints are showing up. It's just that your finger kind of draws the moisture out of the underglaze there. And so it looks lighter and chalkier where your fingers are. With this technique, people are often looking at the piece and trying to tell if they polished it well enough. And then they'll say to me, they'll say, okay, do I have this polished enough? And I usually will pick the piece up and I will run my hands over it and I'll look away from the piece. And they're always like, well, how can you tell? And I said, I'm doing it by touch. I'm not doing it by sight, because sometimes when you look at it, you get those lighter areas like where your fingerprints are showing up and it doesn't look as smooth and polished. But if you feel it, it's a lot better. And I'm trying to think, Jess, this morning you were talking about something too, and you said that you kind of look away or don't look at the piece. I can't remember what that was. And I kind of laughed.
Yeah.
What was
when
it?
I'm centering, well, when I'm teaching
Yeah.
people how to center and they're really struggling, I tell them to put a blindfold on or close their eyes or just don't look at what you're doing. It's all by feel. And it seems ridiculous, but you will know it when it's centered. You feel it. It's just it's like, you know, and you can't explain it. They have to do it.
You feel it. Yep. And that's kind of how it is with this. And so if you run your hands over it like this and you feel areas that feel kind of rough and grainy and they don't feel real smooth, like the bottom of this, I didn't polish and it feels way different than the sides and the top. And the very tippy top on here, I didn't get color on there because I'm going to do the black ice is going to go and drip down. So I'm not worried about the very top, but I can feel a big difference with how the bottom feels. And so I'll go over and polish that. And so the polishing, you know, some people will spend a ton of time polishing. I just look for that nice, smooth, and it kind of tightens up the pores on the piece and gives you a really smooth finish on there once you have done that polishing. Got any questions up to this point?
Oh, well, yeah, lots.
All right.
So I'll go back. So people are shocked that you're polishing underglaze. They had no idea you could do that.
Yep.
So there's that. What raku clay brand do you use?
Again, I get my clay through Continental Clay. I'm in Wisconsin and Continental Clay is in Minneapolis. And so I get skids of, 3,000 pounds of clay shipped in at a time. And so I use their clay, but when I travel and do workshops, I use clay from all over the country, and most brands have a form of raku clay. So I haven't found a bad one yet.
Just check it with your clay distributor and see what they have for raku clay in your area. So how long is a piece held in the kiln at temperature until it's pulled out?
So today, that particular vase was in there for probably 3 hours at 950 degrees. And the only reason it was in there is I always panic when I'm doing a live like this, that something is going to go wrong and the kiln's not going to heat up and I'm going to have to go live and the piece isn't ready. So normally I would let it heat up to 900 to 1,000 degrees, and it would probably hold in there for about 15 minutes. I want to make sure that the piece itself is thoroughly heated, because sometimes your thermocouple in there will read 950 degrees, but in reality, your piece may not, if it's a thicker piece, may not be heated all the way through. So give it a little bit of a hold time, but you don't need to do hours and hours hold. But the nice thing, one of the things with the digital kiln is I can program. I think I programmed like a 6-hour hold on there, because sometimes I get busy doing other stuff and I forget to go back. And then I'm like, oh, that's right, I got stuff in the kiln down there I gotta go do. And I don't want those pieces cooling. The other thing that I'll mention, and as a question maybe is coming up or somebody will think of it, is can you just program the kiln to fire the pieces to like the 04, 06, 07, whatever temperature you're firing to, and then have it hold when it gets down to 950 degrees. And I tried that, and it does work, but I also found that I had several pieces splitting when I took them out. And I was kind of puzzled at first as to why. And then I started looking at the shapes of the pieces. And so when I had bigger pieces, kind of this type of a shape, that were much larger, and they had really small openings on the top. And what I kind of figured was happening is these pieces were retaining a lot of heat on the inside. And so they had been up to, 1900 and some degrees. And as they cooled down, and when I took them out, as soon as they hit like 1000 degrees, inside those pieces, there probably was more heat inside there than there was on the outside. And so I generally do my firing of the finish, let the pieces completely cool, and reheat them so that I don't have that risk of those pieces splitting like that.
Fantastic. Do you turn the kiln off because it's electric before you pull your pieces?
No, so I would recommend that. But the kiln that I've got back there, when I order my kilns, I actually get a lid switch on them because I do so much raku in these kilns. And so you can get a switch on the lid that will actually cut the power. So as soon as that lid is lifted, all the power is cut to the inside of the kiln. When you lower the lid, it goes right back to firing. So if you don't have that switch on your lid, it is best to actually turn the power off to the kiln or turn the breaker off if the breaker is handy, so that you aren't in, in a big kiln like that. I get the lid switches because when I do workshops, I worry that somebody is going to go crazy going into that kiln and they're going to come into contact with the elements. If it was just me doing it, I wouldn't really worry so much about it, but that is a true concern that if you're worried at all, or you're working with a smaller electric kiln, cut the power to the kiln so that those elements, if you come into contact with the tongs, you won't get zapped.
And then a question about the wear and tear on the elements of your kiln. Is this bad for it to do raku firing in your electric
I've
kiln?
talked to the kiln manufacturers and it really isn't. They're all just, they kind of are like, no, it really shouldn't. And I just replaced that Gen Ken kiln. I replaced a Scut kiln that I had for probably nine years, and I never replaced the elements in that kiln in 9 years. And I did a lot of firing with that. So, and I've had many kilns over the years that I've used.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, while
So
you're looking for other questions,
were you burnishing on greenware or bisqueware just now?
That's a great question. I do it on bisqueware because in workshops, and you can do it on greenware, but I do it on bisqueware because usually in workshops, people start polishing and they're pressing and they forget that it's greenware and then they break their piece. So greenware or bisque will work. If you're working on greenware, just remember not to put too much pressure or, holding it like this and, doing that with it. You're probably going to snap it if it's greenware.
So do you still bisque fire at 04 if you're going to be using the black ice glaze?
No, and so the black ice glaze is just kind of an accent on the pieces. I'm not covering the whole piece with the black ice. If I was glazing inside and out with a fritted glaze like the black ice, a glossy glaze, I would worry about getting bubbles and craters in my glaze because there would be gases trying to get out. But because I'm just doing accents of it and some drips of that color down there, I'm not worried about that piece being slightly underfired. And raku pieces too, you guys, they're not designed to hold water. So even though these are vases, if I glaze the inside with a clear glaze or a color glaze, there's a good chance that it's going to get crazing, small cracks in the finish, and water can seep through those cracks. When people really want to do that, I will tell them, you can glaze the inside, but you're probably going to get some crazing. So I suggest to them, I say, you can put like a Thompson's water seal or something you can pour in there, swish it around, dump it out. But just like your deck, you need to reseal it every once in a while. So it's not ideal to try and use these to hold water. I know, Jess, you had talked earlier about trying some resin, like inside raku pieces and things. I don't know.
You can, I found out, yes, you can. Yes. So you can use a epoxy 2-part resin that you mix up. There's a bunch of companies out there. Total Boat is a company. Art Resin makes a food safe version. So you could actually use them for food, but you put a coat of that in there. Now they are all self-leveling usually, so they try to run to the bottom. So you just do a very small coat, or they have these machines you can actually buy that you put it in and then it turns it for you, so it keeps rotating while it dries. It's crazy. But yeah, you can make your raku pieces sealed inside and out, and they can be food safe and even up to 300 degrees. They can hold food. and hot
Cool.
liquids. It's crazy. So yeah, there are
Right.
ways to make them food safe. It's I just learned about that recently. And they
Okay.
can
Yeah,
hold
I've got some
flowers,
two-part
water,
epoxy
whatever.
here, and I haven't had a chance to try it yet.
Yeah, it's the kind, it comes in liquid, you pour them into cups and by
Yep.
weight, and you mix it all up, and it takes about 24 hours to be cured and then another 2-3 weeks to fully cure, but
Okay.
it's pretty amazing stuff.
All right. All right. Well,
Something
while
for
you're
you to try,
looking for
Michael.
other questions, I'm going to talk about the feathers and the hair. So I mentioned with horsehair, it doesn't matter what color it is. I talked about the coarseness. So tail hair is usually more coarse than the mane hair. And so you'll usually get thicker lines with that coarser tail hair. But it also takes, the piece needs to be a little bit hotter to burn that more coarse hair. And I get people that always ask, can I use hair from my dog? Can I use hair from my head? I've had once in a workshop that I had a woman in a workshop where she had really thick, coarse hair. And she's like, could I burn some of my hair? And I was like, usually human hair doesn't work very well. And she's like, well, I'm going to try it. And she reaches up at her head and she pulls out a lot of hair, and she tried it and it worked. But we've got dogs, and I've tried dog hair and stuff, and it usually does not leave much of a line on there. So the line is created, it's like a carbon deposit that's left. And so on really fine hair, like I tried our golden retriever hair, and that didn't work. It burned and it smelled, but it didn't really leave a carbon deposit on there. So horsehair is best. People always ask, well, where can I get horsehair? If you know somebody who has horses, when they brush their horses, ask them to save the hair. You don't need a ton of it, but you can also order horsehair online. It's used a lot of times for strings on musical instruments and things. And so you can get tail hair or mane hair, and it comes in different lengths. And so I don't recommend like a 6-inch length, because you want to have enough length so that your fingers aren't coming real close to the piece. But I bought a bundle of hair years ago, and this is the bundle that I got. And this was mane hair, and I've had this for probably 15 years, and I still have this much left. I mean, I've used in workshops quite a bit, so the hair goes a long way. So when somebody brushes their horse, you don't need a lot of hair, and it doesn't, again, matter what color. I've got red hair, I've got blonde hair, I've got black hair. Doesn't matter what color the hair is, they're all going to leave a black carbon deposit. When it comes to feathers, a lot of people think that they need a nice feather that's real solid. And if you put a solid feather on a piece that's not a fluffy feather, you're going to get this really dark spear shape on your piece. And I don't think it's real attractive. Feathers where they have solid areas like this, they're going to leave a solid black area. So and these are craft feathers that I get at the craft store. So it doesn't matter if they're pink or they're blue or they're white or they're purple, they will all work as long as they are a natural feather. So when I have this one, it's kind of a spear on the top and it's real solid. I'll usually kind of go and kind of pull that down and try to fluff it out a little bit. If I can't get that to fluff out, I'll take a scissors and just snip that tip off on there if it doesn't get fluffy, because if it's real solid, you're just going to get a real big dark area on there. So you want kind of the fluffier feathers to do that. If you want to do something real big, and I'm going to push these feathers aside and put my vases aside. The other day when I banded, I did this real large platter. And I did a workshop one time where we did these large platters, and I found these large, I think they were ostrich feathers in the craft department. And we just did one big feather in the middle of the piece. And I'll post some pictures later of those finished pieces. But these are really nice, fluffy feathers. And I've got a piece of plastic that's sticking to me, static in here. These really big feathers are really cool to take and just do in the middle of a platter, or on a real big platter like this. You could do like 3 of them on the piece. You normally have kind of a side of the feather that goes down. And I usually try to place that down side against the surface. And if I'm holding it on this end with my finger or a pliers, when I place that down, I try to get that tip down, and then I work my way pressing down to the end here. with real big ones like this, if you're doing it outside, sometimes the wind will catch this and blow the feather, and you don't get a real good stamp of that feather on there. So I usually try to block the wind. If it's a breezy day, I'll have other people in the workshop kind of hold a sheet of cardboard to block the wind, so that as that person who's doing this goes to put it on there, the wind doesn't blow it over. I find a lot of times with really large platters, this is about a 20-inch bowl, on really large pieces like this, a lot of times I get cracking with big pieces like this. That's a lot of stress on a big piece. So a lot of times I will put a shelf up in the kiln and have this close to the top of the kiln, and I will open the lid of the kiln, let that initial burst of heat come out, and then with gloves on, I will reach in and do my feather inside the kiln, because then you don't have to worry about the wind or the breeze, and you can just close the lid of that kiln, maybe prop it a little bit, and that piece will cool slowly enough that there's less chance of that piece splitting from the shock of the cold. You can also do the horsehair on there too. So sometimes I'll do a big feather in the middle and I'll do horsehair around the edges. Now, if you get a piece that you do and it doesn't turn out, like you get too much hair on there, your feathers don't turn out good, you just don't like the look of it, just put that piece back in. And if you take it up to 1400 degrees, it'll usually burn that carbon away and you can redo that piece. Now, the more times you redo raku pieces, the more chance there is of the piece of splitting. So don't overdo it. Usually, I'll tell people we can refire it once, but you do risk those pieces splitting. And sometimes pieces will split and there's really no true explanation for it. When I pull them out of the kiln, and I always tell people, wait till I have the tongs off of the piece and the piece is stable before you come and start putting the hair on there, because I don't want to have the piece tip into them. And I'm like, if you hear a very loud thud type of a cracking sound, just step away from the piece, because and it's a very distinct sound of a piece cracking, and you'll usually see the crack in there. And I usually tell people just step away, because I don't want the piece to split and fall and hit them. And occasionally it happens that pieces split, and there isn't a whole lot that you can do about that.
So would peacock feathers work?
Peacock feathers, yes, that is a good question. I did a peacock feather one time, and peacock feathers have kind of, that big top piece that's real solid and colorful and pretty. And then they kind of have little pieces that kind of stick out. What I ended up with was this really dark top that was all solid black. And then there was the stem, and then there were the little pieces coming out. And it's not pretty like a peacock feather is, because it's just a solid black blob up on the top. So I find that the real fluffy feathers really do work the best.
And do you venture kiln when you're doing a raku firing?
No. Well, so when I'm doing a feather firing or horsehair firing, I'm not really worried about venting, because there's really not anything more going on than just basically heating the piece. When I'm doing, like I'm going to do tomorrow, we're going up to, the 1800 degree range. I usually do have the top peephole plug out on the kiln, but I really don't vent otherwise. My kilns inside the house have kiln vents on them, the ones that are in that indoor-outdoor area. So that room out there, two sides of it completely open up. There's doors on casters that roll out and open up. So when we're doing firings out there, and tomorrow when we have a lot of smoke from the paper and things burning, I'm going to open up those sides. But it's just chilly out there, and I didn't want to freeze my butt off out there today.
So we got questions about what other things can you burn? What about sheep hair or goat hair?
Yep. So play around with things. I have tried a lot of different things, and people will be like, can I go pick some weeds and try that? And so most things don't leave a carbon deposit like hair and feathers do. And so I haven't tried sheep's wool. I think that's probably just going to kind of leave black blobs on there. I like the thin strands of the horsehair, the effect that it gives, but give it a try on something. If you don't like it, burn it off and try something else.
And folks were asking, is splitting the same as cracking?
Yeah, yep. And it is a loud thud. It is a deep thud that you hear when it happens, and most people kind of jump back naturally because they're like, oh, what's going on there? And it's you, once you hear it, you'll know that sound.
So we got 2 minutes left. So if anybody's got any last minute questions, or if you want,
I'm just going to go grab that base, should be cool, and I'm just going to talk quickly about cleaning it up and sealing it. So once I bring that piece back in, you're going to have strands of hair, and there's ash on that piece. And so I just take a washcloth and I go over and I wipe off that ash. Normally, I don't need to wash this at all. And then I will usually do some type of a sealer. And so lots of artists have different ideas for sealers, everything from car wax to furniture polish to all different ways of doing this. None are right or wrong. What I like to seal the pieces with is a brush on sealer. So like Mako makes a brush on, there's a gloss and a matte. This one is the matte.
The focus
This is
isn't
the
getting it. It's the
AC502.
Thank you. And you sell that? You have that?
Yeah, and the gloss is the AC501, and just brush a coat of that on there. And so the matte won't really add much of a shine to it, but the gloss will give it more of a shine. So you can see the feathers here, and this isn't going to wash off. The only way that you're going to get this to come off is to burn it away. And so
and
this
those
piece
sealers
is still,
don't get fired, right? Those are
no, the sealers
finish.
don't.
You're
Those
done.
just go on. And like I said, furniture polish, there's all different, you'll find lots of different things that people use out there. And so, yeah, your piece is done then. One last thing, if we've got, it looks like we have a minute left here.
Yeah, we do.
Is sometimes I get questions, and this question might be there and just hasn't gotten to it, is if you've got a manual kiln rather than a digital kiln. And you can do this in a manual kiln, just put like an 06 or an 04 cone in the kiln, and then use like a digital pyrometer to monitor the temperature in that kiln. And that will tell you when you get up to 1,000 degrees. So there's a probe, like a pyrometer or a thermocouple that goes in, put it in a peephole, monitor the temperature in there. And the only reason I say to put like an 04 or an 06 cone in there is if you forget about it, the kiln won't overfire. Sometimes people will lift that plunger and they'll push in the little thing that you push in on the kiln sitter, and then they'll gently let that weight down so that it doesn't pop that button out. And that's very dangerous, because if you forget that stuff is in there, that kiln is going to keep heating. By having a cone in there, it will shut off at some point and it won't overfire.
Fantastic. Safety first always, right?
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Michael. We're sadly out of time
thanks,
for
you guys.
this. Michael,
back with us tomorrow for more raku firing, so be sure to come back and check that out. If you have any questions for him, you can always reach out to Michael. His website is learnfiredarts.com. Michael also does weekly, well, every few weeks, a live broadcast, right, Michael? Every few weeks he does on his page on Facebook, which is Michael Harbridge, so you can check that out as well. Now, we have coming up next at 5:30 our giveaways for the day, and we have a little bit of schedule change. Some things have happened for tomorrow, so I'm going to let you all know about that.